Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Meetinghouse, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dr. Dwight A. Moody, coming to you from our Blue Ridge studio in North Carolina. But we're broadcasting on the radio out of Brunswick, Georgia, and on the television out of Louisville, Kentucky. Wherever you are, we're glad that you've joined us today for our conversation. As always, I have news stories. This week, 6 news stories about what's going on in the world of religion. At the end of the show, I have a book review of this book, Robert E. Lee and Me. Southerners especially, and those interested in the Civil War, will be interested in the book. But the main purpose of our gathering today is to talk about Pentecostal Prophecy. Pentecostal Prophecy. And my guest is Dr. Jim Beverly. He's coming to us from New Brunswick up in Canada. And he is a research professor at Tyndall Seminary in Toronto and also serves as the associate director of the Institute for the Study of American Religion in Santa Barbara, California. He is a specialist in this phenomenon of Pentecostal prophecy, and I am a very curious reader and questioner about it. It has come to the public's attention because they predicted Trump's victory this past year, and it didn't happen, and we're going to talk to him about that. Jim, welcome to the Meetinghouse today.
Hey, thanks, Dwight. It's great to be with you.
What's the weather like up there in New Brunswick?
Oh, we just had a storm, so there's about 4 feet of snow in my front yard. It's been very cold the last week, but today it's warming up. But it's a typical Canadian winter. Lots of snow.
4 feet of snow, my.
Yep.
We're itching for spring and warm weather, and I went out today in North Carolina without a jacket on. So it's pretty nice. I don't envy your position up there in New Brunswick.
Well, it's one thing about the snow, it creates beautiful scenery.
It does that.
I admire it from my back window.
I see. Well, before we get into our conversation on Pentecostal prophecy and how it intersects with American politics, we turn to the news brought to you by Perfecto Coffee of California. This is a company that was launched by 2 of my students when I was teaching at Georgetown. PerfectoCoffeeInc.com. You can go there and order some coffee. So here's the news, and we begin in Concord, North Carolina, not very far from where I am right now. I reported some weeks ago on the series of apologies made by prophets in the Pentecostal movement, like Jeremiah Johnson, after they wrongly predicted a victory for presidential candidate Trump. After they apologized, many of their followers turned on them, not for their misguided prophecy, but for apologizing. Thousands have responded by canceling their subscriptions and withdrawing their financial support. Mr. Johnson, just outside of Charlotte where he lives, is shutting down his ministry completely, website, Twitter, Facebook, everything. Quote, "We're choosing to radically obey Jesus over any other voice in this season," he said. We're going to talk more about this in just a few minutes. From Louisville, Kentucky, Mary Alice Lawler spent 40 years building a reputation as a stellar 4th grade teacher at Our Lady of Lourdes School in Louisville. When she died last fall, she left an estate of $7 million, which this week it was announced that she's leaving most of that estate to the Catholic charities and schools in the Archdiocese, including her own school and her own parish, St. Raphael, whose pastor, I might say, is a friend of mine and an AOP preacher named Shane Duvall. Other beneficiaries include Assumption High School, St. Meinrad Archabbey, and the Catholic Charities of Louisville. And here we go from Houston again. Influential Bible teacher Beth Moore announced she is no longer considers herself a Southern Baptist. During a phone interview last week with Religion News Service, she explained, quote, "I am still a Baptist, but I can no longer identify with Southern Baptist, with some of the things in our heritage that haven't remained in the past," end quote. More recently ended her lucrative partnership with Lifeway Publishing, the publishing arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. She got her start at First Baptist Church in Houston and then launched Living Proof Ministries. The turning point came when she heard the Hollywood Access tapes of Donald Trump. Quote, she said, "This wasn't just immorality. This smacked of sexual assault," end quote. In 2018, during the Me Too movement, Moore went public with her own story of sexual abuse while growing up. And we go back to Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court took the side of a single student at a Georgia college who claimed he was prevented from speaking a religious message in a free speech zone on his campus. The case is curious for several reasons. First, it was an 8-1 decision, with the lone dissenter being Chief Justice Roberts. And he dissented because, and this is the other reason, the plaintiff and the defendant had already settled out of court. The college reversed its policy. So even though the case was, as lawyers say, moot, the court allowed it to proceed because the plaintiff had filed for damages of $1. And that is what must be adjudicated by a lower court. So the case may be more about procedure and precedent than religious freedom. In New York, Seminary President Serene Jones announced that Dr. Cornel West is leaving Harvard and rejoining the faculty of Union Theological Seminary, where he started his teaching career 40 years ago. He is coming from Harvard, where he had been working as what they call a professor of the practice. He ran into resistance from the administration when he requested tenure. He has taught at their School of Divinity and of Law and in their African American Studies program. In the announcement, West is quoted as saying, quote, "I am honored to return back home to Union, to a place with brilliant faculty and moral tenacity," end quote. That's a great phrase, moral tenacity. And then in Louisville, if I may indulge all of you for just a minute, last week, 33 people from 17 states joined me and attended the Zoom launch party hosted right here in the Meetinghouse. We were celebrating the addition of television to our distribution network. A good time was had by all, especially the 4 people who won the drawing for a bag of coffee. And 21 of those who attended pledged to join our Circle of 70, we call it, that is, donors to the Meetinghouse. You can also be a donor. Go to the support page on our website, themeetinghouse.net, and there give you directions about how you can give. Well, that's the news from the Meetinghouse, brought to you by PerfectoCoffeeInc.com of Paris, California. Visit their website and try out some of their coffee. I'll be back in a minute with Dr. Beverly. You're in the Meetinghouse, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dr. Dwight A. Moody, coming to you from our Blue Ridge studio in the mountains of North Carolina. We're talking about Pentecostal prophecy. My guest is Dr. James Beverly from his snow-covered home in New Brunswick. Well, I want to ask you about prophecy. In the Pentecostal tradition, this is this a new phenomenon, or is it a long-standing practice among Pentecostals?
Long-standing from the earliest days of the Pentecostal revivals in the early part of the 20th century. But prophecy became more of a focus about 30 years ago when the famous charismatic leader John Wimber welcomed the Kansas City prophets into the Vineyard community. He made prophets like Paul Cain, Bob Jones, and John Paul Jackson famous, and he traveled the world with those three prophets. And so ever since, prophecy's been big in both charismatic churches and more traditional Pentecostal churches.
Now, we are accustomed to things like healing and speaking in tongues, being seen, witnessed, and experienced in Pentecostal gatherings. Is this gift of prophecy something that's done in a public assembly, or is it done in private?
It's both. Sometimes the prophets get a prophetic word in private. Other times you can see people prophesying at church meetings or conventions. Or now with the internet, you can see prophets declaring God's word right on your internet site.
Yes, in my research for this program today, I was struck by that the prophets receive their prophecies in private, and they'll send them out by text or tweet or on a video, and not in a public meeting. Have you been in Pentecostal meetings when this prophecy has been declared by one of these prophets?
Oh, yeah. I've been studying prophecy for probably 4 decades. So even in the 90s, I was at vineyard events where prophecy was big. I did the same kind of coverage when the Toronto Blessing hit, the Holy Laughter movement in the mid-90s. So I went to a big event in Toronto to hear Paul Cain. And I've been with Mike Bickle, the famous preacher from Kansas City, who's at IHOP, the International House of Prayer. So yeah, I've seen the prophets up close. I've interviewed some of them. I've written 2 books about prophecy. 2 books that focus on prophecy, at least in part. I wrote a book. Even show a picture here. I wrote this book, Holy Laughter and the Toronto Blessing. It came out in 95. And then last year I did this book. I don't know if I sent it to you, Dwayne.
You did, and I actually read it and reviewed it. It's on our website, my review on it. We're going to talk about it in just a minute. Before we get to all the Trump stuff, other than presidential politics, what are typical subjects of prophecy?
Well, basically, the prophets are quite positive. So if you go to the best repository of prophecies on the internet, it's the Elijah list. Most of the prophecies are very positive, talking about God's blessing on his people, God's blessing on the church. There's a lot of predictions about revival coming, evangelism increasing.
Is there any prophecy or conversation related to the end of the world? Those types of things.
Yeah, there's prophecies that we're near the end. That's been a frequent theme in larger evangelical circles. I mean, one thing about you and me, Dwight, is that we're old enough to have lived through previous predictions about, Jesus is coming soon.
Yes, for many years I had on my bookshelf a book entitled 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Returning in 1988. And of
And did
course,
you
go ahead.
go ahead? Well, did you know that he was wrong, obviously, but he redid the book about Jesus coming back in 1989, and that didn't happen.
That didn't happen either. Well, of course, there's a whole series of denominations, including the Seventh-day Adventist. I've had two programs recently with people who happen to be Seventh-day Adventist, and that was a movement built around a what we would have to say a false prediction of the end of the world. This happens many times. You and I remember Hal Lindsey and all the books that he wrote, The Terminal Generation and all that,
Right.
back when we were both younger ministers.
Now, one thing that the prophets in the charismatic world, they've learned not to set dates, so they won't give a specific year. But it's clear, generally speaking, the prophets think that we're near the end and Jesus is returning. But thankfully they don't predict dates.
Well, I am so interested in this prophecy movement. Are these prophets always men? You've used the masculine pronoun time and time again.
Yeah, most of them are men, but there are some women. In fact, now most of the charismatic prophets in America have been pro-Trump. There's one prophet who's been very critical of Trump, and that particular prophet's a woman. She came out clearly against Trump when he ran in 2016.
Well,
Most are men, but there's some very powerful women in the prophetic charismatic world, like, for example, Cindy Jacobs.
right.
She's a powerhouse in the world of charismatic.
And when you say she's a powerhouse, what do you mean by that? She has a big following?
I think she has 800,000 or 900,000 people on her Facebook feed. She's a major. She's even called a general in the movement of. Well, she's connected with what's called the New Apostolic Reformation. It's just the term for a large group of charismatic ministers worldwide.
And where is her base of operation?
Texas. My scholar friend Gordon Melton is doing a book on Texas Pentecostals. So he lives in Texas. He works at Baylor University. He's he's the head of that institute that I'm associate director in. It moved. I should have told you. It moved from Santa Barbara to Waco, Texas.
Oh, and so it's part of Baylor. Well, Baylor has a very prestigious program in the sociology of religion and the religion department.
Yeah, it's amazing. Now, the Gordon's Institute is separate from Baylor, but he's one of their famous professors. He's probably he's a friend, but I can say this objectively. He's probably the greatest scholar of religion alive today.
Really? I need to get to know him and schedule him for a visit to the Meetinghouse, don't you think?
Yeah, one of his books, his Encyclopedia of American Religions, is 2 million words long.
Wow.
So he's a great scholar, and he and I are actually working together on updating prophecies about Trump in the charismatic and Pentecostal world.
Well, I did read, let's turn to that now. I did read your book. So tell us how this pattern of Trump prophecies started. When did it start and who started it?
Well, most people date the earliest prophet or prophetic figure to talk about Trump to be Kim Clement.
Right.
So I think that's accurate, though Kim's prophecies are often vague. So he wasn't super clear about Donald Trump. The biggest credit for origin goes to Jeremiah Johnson, who in the summer of 2015 said that God told him that Trump would be a wrecking ball to political correctness. He didn't know much about Trump at the time, and he put out the prophecy, and then he got attacked for it, it made him nervous a bit, but time has proven that he was right to say that Donald Trump will be a wrecking ball. So Jeremiah Johnson's early, also Lance Wallnau, who is a business guy from Dallas, who's become a prophetic figure himself. He says that God told him about the same time that he might have been the one that did the wrecking ball. But both Jeremiah Johnson and Lance Wallnau talked about Trump being used by God, even though at the time Trump was not popular and he was not the first choice among evangelicals.
No, we all remember this, how these prophets came out and their message was counter to the Republican establishment, the polls, the mood of the country, what everybody was expecting. And that's what made their prophecy so striking and their accuracy so stunning. Don't you think?
Yes. Although one thing I would tell listeners and viewers is prophecy is not the kind of thing that you can absolutely bet on or be certain of. The prophets are sometimes wrong in major ways. The same prophets that got things right about Trump in 2016, they were wrong on Mitt Romney winning in 2012. Mm-hmm. They were wrong on predicting a Republican landslide in 2018. And it sure looks like they were wrong about Trump winning last November. Although that led to a big battle, as you know.
Yes, we're gonna talk about that in a minute. So when prophets predict, let's say, Mitt Romney winning, and then he doesn't, what does that do to their credibility or their standing in their communities?
Well, it hurts, but it doesn't destroy their reputation because it's not built on just
a single prophecy.
Yeah, and the prophets don't claim to be infallible. They believe that the gift of prophecy is like the gifts that others have. We know that there are people with the gift of teaching, but they're not infallible, or the gift of preaching, they're not infallible. So the same with the prophets; they don't claim infallibility.
Now, let me go back to the Pentecostal culture. How is this taught in Pentecostal universities and seminaries? Do they teach speaking in tongues and words of faith and prophecy? I mean, are there courses work in a seminary on these things?
Yeah, it would depend on which seminary and what size it is, but it's just standard Pentecostal doctrine to say that speaking in tongues is a sign of the baptism of the Holy Spirit. Most Pentecostals don't think speaking in tongues is necessary for salvation, but it is necessary to have the fullness of the Holy Spirit. So Pentecostal seminaries are going to be into speaking in tongues, healing, and then word of knowledge. You know, word of knowledge is something that fascinates me because I love collecting stories of where God speaks to people about specific things. Like if I said now, word of knowledge, Dwight, your wife's name is Carla. How am I doing?
No, you missed it.
Okay. Well, see, some people, I believe some people hear from God, and that's called a word of knowledge. Now, again, people aren't infallible about it. Anyway, that's an element in Pentecostalism and in charismatic Christianity, and the same with prophecy. Though I don't think prophecy is as big in traditional denominations as it became in the Vineyard movement or the Toronto Blessing or in the New Apostolic movement. I think traditional Pentecostal churches would be a bit toned down on the topic, which is interesting from a movement that's known for being, pretty lively and even wild.
So, so the Trump prophecies started back about 2007, I think, and
You mean the Trump prophecies, 2015?
2015,
Yeah.
Um, and they were pretty widespread. There were a number of prophets who predicted Trump's win in 16. Am I not right about that?
Yeah. Early on, it was Lance Wallnau, Jeremiah Johnson, another prophet in America. I think her name was Jill Steele. And then there's also a famous Australian woman prophet, Lana Vawser. They led the way into 2016. And then after Trump won, it became a flood of prophecies about him.
Yes,
So,
I read your book, and your book, of course, is a catalog of all of these, and I was fascinated by this. You offer actually very little commentary on these things, but you do coordinate these prophecies with well-known public events. So,
right.
as something was occupying our time in the news, these prophets were getting more or less specific about Donald Trump and um, uh, his reelection and all of that. So this really just mushroomed, didn't it, throughout the
Oh,
Trump prophecy? And Trump loved it, didn't he?
oh yes, he did.
And
I have friends who know him, and they tell me that they believe that Trump believes in Jesus as his savior. Uh, I think early on he was a rookie on spiritual things. You can
I,
tell when he met with some famous Christian leaders that he knew he was out of his league in terms of Bible knowledge or theological stuff. I think over the last 5 years he's got more acquainted with the Bible and Christian things. Now everybody, Dwight, knows that there's areas of his life where he needs some sanctification.
well, it's certainly, we as the public, we've gotten very accustomed, we did throughout his tenure in the White House, of seeing him surrounded by religious leaders in with Pentecostal leaders very, very prominent, especially Paula White. So he obviously picked up a lot of their vocabulary, uh,
Yep.
that sort of thing, and it certainly must have had a big influence on him.
Yeah. Now, Michael Cohen, his former lawyer and assistant, says that it's all a con job, that Trump doesn't believe any of it, and he ridicules the evangelicals behind his back. I hope that is not true. That would be just the most glaring example of hypocrisy and two-faced, because he'll bow his head in prayer, he'll hold a Bible. I hope he is sincere, and the people that I know who know him say that they believe he's a believer. Now, of
Well,
course, Trump's enemies think that he's a child of Satan practically. In fact, I don't know this. Let me say something that people hardly know. Everyone knows that evangelicals, especially white evangelicals and charismatics and Pentecostals, they're pro-Trump big time, and they almost go overboard. Well, actually, they do go
they do
overboard.
go overboard, yes.
But on the opposite side, there's a pastor who's put out over 100 videos arguing that Trump is the Antichrist.
Yes.
So
He is a very polarizing figure. He has
he is.
a passionate following, but he has a very determined opposition, and it's a phenomenon, a political phenomenon, even a religious phenomenon that we have never
Absolutely.
seen in our lifetime.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. The division over Trump is astounding in a way.
well, one of my news stories, not only here but in all the media nationwide, is about Beth Moore in
Right.
Houston, who has been the most influential Southern Baptist a female teacher, preacher, and person who, because of the Southern Baptist Convention's embrace of Trump and what we call Trumpism, she is separating herself from the Southern Baptists. That's what Trump has done in many groups, and you're saying there's even some of that in the Pentecostal church.
Right. You know, one thing I'd say to viewers is common sense should teach you that the truth about Trump is unlikely to be on the extremes. He's neither a saint nor a demon. It's somewhere in between. And what people should do is make a list of his good characteristics and his bad ones, his good ideas and his false ones. In fact, if I was in the States and I was a Republican, I would only have Trump back as the chosen leader for the, say, 2024 if he moderated his weaknesses. Mm-hmm. I've even joked that I bet you the New York Times editors or the people at CNN or Washington Post, I bet they would come to believe in God if he performed the miracle of Trump moderating his social media, not being so nasty on his critics, etc., etc.
Well, let me ask you about the prophets. The prophets who gained great standing and in the Pentecostal community over these last 5 years, and a great deal of attention among the rest of us, were very firm and very articulate that Trump was going to be reelected. And then he wasn't. So I have two questions I want to ask you. What is the connection between the prophecy that Trump was going to win and then didn't, and what we now call the big lie that as Trump kept saying that he was going to win and he should have won, that the election was stolen from him, and all this that
Right.
led to the court hearings about all of this. So did this prophecy, this widespread confidence in the Pentecostal and even in the evangelical community that Trump was going to win, did that help fuel this conviction that the election had been stolen?
Well, it did. I think there's a combination of the idea that Trump is God's person, mm-hmm. then the prophecies that he would win. And when he lost, the idea that the election was stolen was a way of explaining how things changed. And then prophets can be divided into two factions in terms of November 3rd. Some of them, like Jeremiah Johnson, have admitted they were wrong,
right,
and they don't try to explain it away. Others have said, no, God said that Trump is the president, and he still is the president, and God is going to work out something amazing to bring Trump back to the White House. Now, as you know, people thought that Trump would come back on January 6th, courtesy of the Electoral College.
Right.
And that didn't happen. And then others prophesied that on January 20th, Biden wouldn't be inaugurated. In fact, one of the funny things is charismatic prophets had the same passion, some of them, as QAnon leaders. Because both charismatic prophets and leaders in the QAnon movement, the conspiracy movement, they were predicting that there's no way Biden would become president on January 20th. So there's an interesting combination. And what it's rooted in my view, is just absolute conviction that you know what is correct. So A, Donald Trump is God's man. B, he won on November 3rd. The election was stolen. And God will work it out to keep his man in the White House.
I had a long conversation yesterday with a pastor friend of mine out near Joplin, Missouri, who is a Pentecostal pastor, and we talk frequently. And I asked him about this, and he said it has even gone so far in their network that people think that the person in the White House is not Joe Biden, that it's a double or a stand-in, that Joe Biden is sick mentally and physically, and that this is that there are many people in the Pentecostal tradition who are thinking this.
Yeah, they're probably picking that up from QAnon. QAnon is the conspiracy movement that started in October 2017, and it's pro-Trump. The sad thing about it is there's an element that is so far-fetched and ridiculous, but even theories that look totally false get believed. You know, in the QAnon world, JFK Jr. was supposed to come back in October and be Trump's vice president.
Well, do you think the Pentecostal prophets are aware of this connection to QAnon?
Well, some of them. For example, there's a guy named Dave Hayes. Now he's not. He's charismatic, believes in visions and dreams. I'm not sure if he's a card-carrying Pentecostal, but he's a major QAnon teacher. But the QAnon ideas have circulated widely, even when people don't know where they come from. Thankfully, most Christian leaders don't go for the really wild stuff. And people close to Trump, like General Michael Flynn, the retired general, he's gone public and said, no, there is no plan to retake the White House. Mm-hmm. No, Trump is not currently working with the military. So some of that, the wild stuff has been dampened down. Also, the failures, like Biden occupied the White House mm-hmm. on the 20th, mm-hmm. and no one stormed the Capitol on March 4th to retake the White House.
Yes, we were focused on the launch of our television broadcast on March the 4th, but I was following that story very, very closely.
Right.
Do you think a lot of the QAnon followers are Pentecostal people?
There'd be some. Mainly, you could divide QAnon people into, broadly speaking, a lot of them would be just regular pro-Trump Republicans who are into the conspiracy movement. And then some of them would be Pentecost, some Baptists, some, whatever denomination. Go ahead.
Well, I want to ask you about Jeremiah Johnson, who was one of the leading prophets predicting Trump's victory in 2016 and then in 2020. And I've been following his story. He apologized for missing it and immediately suffered enormous pushback from his substantial following. Is this customary for prophets to be kind of disowned when they're wrong about something?
No, this is a whole unique reality. I've never seen anything like the heat he and others have received if they announce that Trump didn't win on November 3rd. I actually know Jeremiah. I've met him once when he was based in Florida a couple of years ago. He even got death threats when he issued as an apology. Now, the reason for this is simply because of the passion about Donald Trump right. and about politics and how much some people hate the Democrats and they believe this is a battle of good versus evil. Trump is God's choice, and Jeremiah was wrong to apologize. And hence he's shut down. As of tomorrow at 4:00, he's shutting down his YouTube videos and his Facebook feed and Instagram. And he has 1 million followers on various platforms. So I'm sad that he's shutting everything down, even just for the sake of scholarship and history. All his tremendous Facebook record. I've actually written him privately to ask him to keep it archived so that it's
Archive.
not completely lost. But
Well, you and I share that great interest in keeping records, and so later scholars can interpret them and understand them and use them to shed light on wider social and political issues. So, what happens now in the prophecy movement? Do you sense that the movement that is dissipating or is dissolving, or has it lost any of its clout in the Pentecostal community?
it would have lost some enthusiasm because of so many prophets predicting Trump would win. Gordon Melton has collected a long list, which I'm adding to, and we're up to around 40 or 45 prophets. So the fact that all those prophets got the date or the facts wrong about November 3rd, or at least looks like they did, that hurts. But the prophetic movement is not going to crumble. It will continue. As far as I know, Jeremiah Johnson's the only one shutting down his entire social media. All the others that I've followed, I haven't heard of any that are quitting. I should say one thing, Dwight, about the reality of American politics now. Everything one thinks about America in relation to politics revolves around what you think about November 3rd. Mm-hmm. If you think the election was fair and Biden won, that is so much different than the skeptical view that the election was stolen. You see, everything spins on what you believe on the bottom line. So if you think the election was stolen, well, that makes the resistance to Biden understandable.
Yes, but most of the evidence that can be presented in court or even to a legislature or uncovered by journalists and investigators does not support the idea that it was stolen. So the tendency to believe that it was stolen perhaps is driven by something else, driven by this conviction that Trump was anointed by God to be the president.
Yeah, it's also fueled, though, by all the stuff that looks like things were irregular. Like Newt Gingrich just wrote a piece in the Washington Times arguing why he is not really happy with Joe Biden. That's to put it mildly. Mm-hmm. Even on the November 3rd data, there's evidence of irregularities that have led many people to think the election was stolen. Now, some of it's just social media manipulation, but let me throw a wrinkle in for your audience that, in my view, is fascinating. Anybody who wants to study this should get Patrick Byrne's book called Deep Rig, as in the election was rigged, so Deep Rig. Patrick Byrne is an interesting case because he didn't like Donald Trump, didn't vote for him, but thought there was irregularities that were worth exploring. Now, I'm not telling this to convince anybody what the truth is, because I don't know in terms of, I don't have the adequate training to study this because I don't do mathematics, I don't know statistics, and I don't know computer programming. But Patrick Byrne's interesting because he paid $1.5 million of his own money to hire forensic experts in computer analysis, and he wrote in this book and on his blog, on his website, that the election was stolen. Now, here's the other thing that he says that's interesting. He had a meeting with Donald Trump on December 18th for over 4 hours, where he laid out the case along with Michael Flynn and Sidney Powell. he laid out the case and he said to the president, you should invoke 2 executive orders and have those computers analyzed in those 6 swing states. In the end, Trump chose to follow the path that Rudy Giuliani laid out in court filings, and none of that worked out very well.
Didn't work out. Do you know the religious affiliation of this man?
No, my guess is agnostic, but I'm not sure. Might be Christian, don't know.
Do you know
But
where he is? Is he at a university or a
No,
research center, or is he a lone ranger type?
He's Lone Ranger, but very credible. He's famous for fighting Wall Street back in 2008, 2009.
Well, I want to ask you, some of the prophets now are predicting that Trump will run again in 2024, and when he wins, that will be the fulfillment of their prophecies in 2020. Am I not right about this?
Yes, but that's like, to me, that's just a convenient way of ignoring the fact that you were wrong. Like Mark Taylor is famous as the firefighter prophet. He lives in Florida. He predicted Trump would win in 2012. Well, that didn't happen. But when 2016 came around, he said that the prophecies should be reapplied. Now, he was honest enough to admit that he first thought it was for 2012. So he's honest, but I think sometimes it's just better to say I blew it. Sort of like when I said your wife's name earlier, I was wrong. What I should say, it's Cheryl.
I know, and you'd be wrong again.
All right. Let me think.
No.
Okay, I got it now. It's Louise.
No, you're a long way off. Well, it's going to be interesting to see how scholars, both religious and secular scholars, in 20 and 30, 40 years, assess what has happened over the last 5 years, not just in its political implications, but in its impact on the religious culture of America and what it did to this prophetic culture in the Pentecostal tradition. So you and I, both as historians and as archivists, we're hoping everybody is keeping all their records and putting them in libraries somewhere, so people 20, 30, 40 years, maybe doctoral students who are doing a PhD will be writing dissertations on all of this. Right. Don't you think?
Oh, yeah. This is, I've been a professor for over 40 years. This whole thing's one of the most fascinating things I've ever studied.
I think it's fascinating too. I'm not a Pentecostal. I'm very empathetic and sympathetic with the Pentecostal movement. It's been a powerful Christian movement for now 120 years. And I have many friends who are leaders in the Pentecostal movement. So this is part of why I'm curious about it. And I want to thank you for being our guest in the Meetinghouse today. If you get tired of that snow, up to 4 feet of snow in your front yard, you can drive down here or fly down here to North Carolina or Georgia, and we'll show you some sunshine, okay?
Thank you. First you have to get rid of the virus, but hopefully things are winding down in terms of people getting vaccinated. By the way, that brings an example of, Trump is so maligned in some circles, he doesn't even get the credit he deserves. For example, under his presidency, the vaccination story is a miracle. And,
well, that's another whole story in the Meetinghouse, and maybe we'll take it up someday. I'm still trying to get vaccinated. Thank you very much, Jim, for your conversation today. Thanks. And for enlightening me and our audience. I'll be back in just a minute with my book review of Robert E. Lee and Me.
Dwight, let me just say, people can get my books on Trump and evangelicals and QAnon on Amazon.
Yes, I ordered this on Amazon. I sure did, and they can as well. I'll be back in just a minute.
Thanks, Dwight.
You're in the Meetinghouse. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody, with a book review. My library has more than its share of books about conversions, religious conversions, that is, from doubt to faith, from sin to salvation, from lost to found. Books like Born Again by Chuck Colson, Surprised by Joy by C.S. Lewis, and The Seven-Story Mountain, one of the first I ever read by Thomas Merton. I have a long-standing interest in the journey that people make on their way to truth and grace and life, which is why this book appeals to me. It is a conversion story from beginning to end, and one with a quasi-religious dimension. As Seidule points out in this book about his journey, adulation of the famous Southern general Robert E. Lee borders on adoration. There is a religious-like fervency to the way many people feel about the man who led the Confederate armies in the insurrection of 1861. I was almost there at one point, a fan, we might say, enthralled with Lee's military skill and what I thought at the time was his character and discipline and dignity. I've read multiple times the 3-volume set, The Civil War by Shelby Foote, and many times I have visited that famed and fabulous battlefield in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Stars in their courses, Foote entitled that chapter, quoting the Bible. I was a casual student, though, a modest admirer of Robert E. Lee, but Seidule was far more intense in every respect, and that is the narrative of this conversion story, how one true Southerner, himself a 40-year veteran of the U.S. Army, a professor of history at West Point with a PhD from Ohio State University, how he came to grips with his obsession and then, by the grace of God, gave it up, repented, changed his mind, went in another direction. Lee was a traitor, pure and simple, he asserts. He was one of the 9 Virginia natives who had graduated from West Point and, at the time that the Civil War broke out, held the rank of colonel in the U.S. Army. But Lee was the only one who defected, resigned his commission, and took up arms against the country. Details like that abound in this richly researched book. 625 footnotes I counted. Clearly, Seidule has done his homework over many years and distilled it in lectures, articles, speeches, and now this very fine book. Seidule puts Lee in his place, and that place is not in chapels or on monuments or even on the nameplate of a building, all the places where it's been for a century and a half. Lee's place is on the list of men who rebelled against the United States and sought our destruction as a country. His place is on the list of those men who believed, defended, and practiced slavery, enslaving people. He denigrated African Americans as unworthy of citizenship and unable to take care of themselves, incapable of self-determination. Our calling today is to think more of his slaves and their descendants than he did, and to think less of him, Lee that is, and his exploits than his fans have, be those fans soldiers, politicians, relatives, or even historians, like Douglas Southall Freeman, who a century ago wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning 4-volume biography that has so shaped public opinion about Lee. Seidule's book is a powerful testament that people can change. And this is so important in our country today, rife as it is with racism and misinformation. Think of all the people who have embraced the big lie of our 2020 election, that it was, quote, stolen through manipulation of the voting system. It reads so very much like the myth of the lost cause, which is at the heart of the adulation of Robert E. Lee. It is also at the heart of so much of the racism that continues to wreak violence upon our nation and her people. In fact, both the long-standing religion of white supremacy have their roots in the American South, the home turf of both Ty Seidule and me, which helps explain why this book and its witness to transformation is so important to me as a person, as a citizen, as a scholar, and as a Christian. I've always liked a good conversion story. Thank you for joining us today in the Meetinghouse with me, your host, Dwight Moody. Thank you for listening and watching. Visit our website at themeetinghouse.net. There you will find all of my interviews recorded, audio recorded as podcast, all of the book reviews, and my commentaries. I did not get to read or speak my commentary today. You'll find it on the website. It's called The Conversion of a White Man. And it's my testimony to the change in my own life vis-a-vis white supremacy and the needs and dreams of our Black citizens. You can subscribe to my weekly newsletter. I send it out at 8:30 every Wednesday night. That's Eastern Standard Time. You can subscribe at themeetinghouse.net. It's free. You can visit the support page and become a contributor to the Meetinghouse. We'll make you a member of the Circle of 70. We are seeking 70 people who will become contributors to this, people like you who believe in what we're doing and its importance in the American public square. I want to thank you for listening today. Thank my engineer, Everett Armstrong, in the studio in Georgia, and Alex Mattingly in Louisville. We all remember that it's just been 3 weeks ago that we celebrated the 1-year anniversary of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery in Brunswick, Georgia, where Everett is, and it's just been 1 year exactly since Breonna Taylor was murdered in Louisville, Kentucky, where Alex is. We grieve both of these and follow the developments, the legal developments, very closely. Thank you for paying attention to religion and American life. Until next week, I want to ask you to be safe, to do justice, to love mercy, to wash your hands, continue wearing that mask, get a vaccine, drink some coffee, some Perfecto coffee, send a donation to the Meetinghouse, join our Circle of 70. Pray for the soul of America. Be kind to everyone. Give thanks to God. In the Meetinghouse, I'm Dwight A. Moody. You have a great day.